1943, South Pacific. The air smelled like burnt oil and sweat. Engines roared every morning before the sun came up, and the heat didn't care if you were a general or a mechanic. Somewhere between the palm trees and concrete runways of New Guinea sat a man who didn't look like a genius. But the Japanese would soon learn to fear his name, Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Pappy wasn't born into war. He'd been a Navy pilot, a father, and later a civilian airline engineer in the Philippines. But the Japanese invasion had changed everything. When his wife and children were taken prisoner by the enemy, Pappy didn't just join the fight, he rewrote the rules of it. The B-25 Mitchell bombers were never meant to be monsters. They were good planes, twin-engine medium bombers, reliable and decent at high altitudes. But in the Pacific, high altitudes didn't help much. The Japanese ships were fast, low in the water and heavily armed. Flying high meant missing targets. Flying low meant suicide. What they needed was something meaner, something faster, something that could fly right into the mouth of hell and leave fire behind. That's where Pappy came in. He wasn't officially part of any aircraft design team, but he didn't care about titles. He had his own hangar, his own tools, and his own damn mind. He'd looked at a standard B-25 and saw a blank canvas. First, he ripped out the nose, the glass dome where the bombardier would sit. Instead, he packed it with 50 caliber machine guns. Not one or two, but 4. Then he added more in the sides. He mounted extra guns in the fuselage and even more beneath the cockpit. In total, 14 50 caliber machine guns, all firing forward. It was unheard of. Everyone thought he was crazy. "Gun, you're going to flip the damn thing over with all that firepower," one officer joked. Pappy just grinned, a cigarette always hanging from the corner of his mouth. "Let the nose tip down," he'd say. "That's where the fight is anyway." He didn't stop with just guns. He rewired the bomb release system so the planes could carry parafrags, small parachute bombs that could tear through ship decks when dropped from low altitudes. He took what the military gave him and made it terrifying. And when the first few test flights showed success, the pilots started lining up to fly his modified birds. The first real test came over the Bismarck Sea. Japanese supply convoys were moving under heavy escort, confident they'd reach their destination untouched. After all, American bombers flew high and missed too often. Their anti-air guns were ready for that, but they weren't ready for what came next. Pappy's B-25s came in screaming low, just above the ocean spray. Their nose guns lit up the sky, tearing holes through ship decks, anti-air emplacements, and enemy gunners before they could react. Each plane was like a flying shotgun, blasting metal death in every direction. In mere minutes, the convoy was chaos, fires, explosions, men diving into the sea, ships cracking open like eggs. The Japanese never expected medium bombers to come in like fighters. Back at base, when the pilots returned, oil-stained and wide-eyed, they didn't say much. They didn't need to. The bullet holes in their wings and the black soot on their faces told the story. Pappy, as usual, just lit another cigarette. He didn't brag. He wasn't that type. But his name started spreading. Crews began calling the modified planes Strafer B-25s. Some even called them Pappy's Monsters, and the monsters kept growing. Other squadrons started copying his design. The top brass, who once dismissed his methods, now praised him. But Pappy didn't care for medals or promotions. He only cared about 2 things, beating the Japanese and getting his family back. He worked nights, tweaking the designs further. Some planes had up to 10 guns in the nose alone. Mechanics joked that pretty soon the planes wouldn't have room for pilots. But it wasn't a joke to the Japanese. Their convoys began sailing under the cover of night or taking longer routes. They knew what was coming. They knew Pappy's planes flew low and killed fast. Every time they heard a Mitchell engine roar in the distance, they braced for the worst. And more often than not, the worst came. Pappy Gunn had done what engineers in suits couldn't. He turned a bomber into a butcher, a flying beast with teeth of steel. And he did it with nothing but anger, brilliance, and the raw pain of a man who'd lost everything. Smoke still lingered in the air days after the raid on the Bismarck Sea. The enemy had lost 8 ships, cargo transports, Destroyers and fuel carriers all gone in a matter of hours. What was once considered a safe Japanese route had turned into a floating graveyard. Intelligence reports said survivors were pulled from the water days later, still shaken, mumbling about thunder planes that came from nowhere. That's how terrifying the B-25s had become. Back at the airfield in New Guinea, Pappy Gunn leaned against the side of one of his modified bombers, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his weathered face. He looked tired, his khakis stained with oil, but he didn't rest. His eyes kept scanning the tarmac like he was always planning the next change, the next weapon to add. "Captain Gunn," a young pilot said, walking up nervously, "they're saying Tokyo Radio mentioned you by name today." Pappy spat on the ground and lit another cigarette. "Good. Let 'em know I'm coming." That was Pappy. He didn't play politics. He didn't answer to rank. He answered to results, and his monsters got them. But the higher-ups had started watching. A colonel flew in from Australia just to see the planes. He walked around one of the heavily modified B-25s, inspecting the gun barrels, poking from the nose like a snarling animal. He didn't look impressed. "You've overloaded the airframe. You're risking crew safety," the colonel said flatly. Pappy didn't even blink. "Crew's alive because of those guns. Ask 'em yourself. You've altered Army property without authorization." "That Army property just shredded a Japanese convoy to hell," Pappy replied, flicking ash from his cigarette. "Maybe your pen isn't sharp enough to see the value in that." The colonel didn't have a reply. Because how could he? The war had changed, and the old rules didn't work anymore. The Pacific wasn't Europe. It was jungles, islands, heat and ocean, and the enemy didn't fight fair. So why should they? The pilots sure didn't complain. They lined up for Gunn's planes like kids begging for candy. One of them, Lieutenant Brooks, a kid barely out of college, hugged the landing gear before takeoff. "Feels like climbing into a steel dragon," he laughed. "God bless that crazy old man." Brooks returned from that mission with 2 engine hits and half a tail, but alive. His co-pilot had taken shrapnel to the leg, and the side gunner's face was black with smoke. But the B-25 had torn through 2 Japanese patrol boats and still made it home. The medics patched them up. The mechanics patched up the plane. And Brooks just sat on the ground, laughing like he'd seen the devil and gotten away with it. "You trust Gunn's design now?" someone asked him. He just nodded. "That thing doesn't fly. It hunts." The myth of Pappy Gunn kept growing. But he was no myth. He was just a man who worked through the night, sketching blueprints on scrap paper, trading favors for spare parts, and constantly arguing with mechanics to install one more gun, one more tweak, one more ounce of fury into his flying machines. He barely slept. He barely ate. He had a picture of his wife taped to the inside of his toolbox. Her name was Clara, and she'd been captured in the Philippines along with their children. Every nut and bolt he turned, every gun he mounted, was a scream for them. "They took my family," he once said to a fellow mechanic. "So I'm going to take everything from them." And he meant it. The Japanese started retreating faster than usual. Their ships sailed farther from the coastline. Even their air patrols changed tactics, flying higher and wider to avoid sudden ambushes from these gun specials. One Japanese intelligence report, later recovered after the war, had scribbled notes about Pappy's bombers. Unstoppable, sudden, like ghosts with fire. But Pappy wasn't satisfied, not yet. He had a new idea brewing, a way to rig the B-25s to drop low-altitude napalm over jungle encampments. His engineers called it insane. "That's a suicide run," one of them said. Pappy just smiled. "Good, then they won't expect it. Because in 1943, in the sweltering hell of the Pacific, you didn't win wars by playing safe. You won them by showing the enemy something they'd never forget." And Pappy Gunn, he wasn't building bombers anymore. He was building fear. The rain came down hard the next morning, washing streaks of fuel and blood from the cracked concrete of the airstrip. But work didn't stop, not here. Engines still roared under the grey sky, and men still crawled under wings with wrenches and bullets. War didn't care if the weather was bad. Neither did Pappy Gunn. Inside a makeshift hangar, he stood over a stripped-down B-25 frame, sleeves rolled up, arms black with grease. He stared at the nose section like a painter, studying a blank canvas. Around him, sparks flew from welding torches, and tools clanked like metal music in the rain. He was quiet, focused, but something was different today. He had a telegram in his shirt pocket. It was folded, worn from how many times he'd pulled it out and stared at it. A new piece of intelligence, the kind that made his hands shake just a little. The Japanese were moving a secret convoy, heavy supplies, artillery, fuel, through the Celebes Sea. He knew that route, narrow, shallow, and surrounded by jungle-covered islands. Perfect for an ambush, perfect for monsters. He called a briefing that night, dragging in pilots, gunners, mechanics, anyone who'd fly or fix. He didn't use big words. He didn't stand on a podium. He just stood in front of a wall map with a lit cigarette and circled an area in red. "We hit 'em here," he said. "Real low, real fast. No warning." A voice in the crowd asked, "How heavy is the escort?" "Too heavy," Pappy replied without blinking. "That's why we hit 'em with everything we've got." There were nods. No fear. These men had flown with guns monsters before. They'd felt the kick of the nose guns, seen ships explode under them, smelled burning fuel and flesh in the air. They trusted the machines. They trusted the man behind them even more. For this mission, Pappy added something new. He mounted forward-facing rocket launchers beneath the wings, makeshift rails made from salvaged parts. No manual, no test flight, just a hunch. "We're not flying bombers anymore," he told the squad. "We're flying angry." By dawn, the planes were armed and humming on the runway. You could smell the anticipation, thick, metallic, charged like lightning. Guns-modified B-25s lined up like hungry wolves, noses packed with guns, tails heavy with death. The pilots climbed in, checking ammo belts and tapping photos of sweethearts taped near their controls. No one said much. Talking didn't help once you were in the sky. Pappy didn't fly anymore. Not since his knee got messed up in an earlier crash landing. But he stood at the edge of the runway, watching them roar into the clouds one by one, until only the smoke was left behind. 3 hours later, the radios lit up. Convoy in sight, 5 freighters, 3 destroyers. "Heavy fire incoming, Jesus, it's thick." Another voice, calm and sharp. "Let's give 'em hell, boys. Line up on the lead ship." Nose guns hot. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Pappy's planes came in low, skimming the waves, opening fire before the Japanese could even adjust their aim. Bullets tore through deck guns, ripped apart radar stations, shattered command bridges. Rockets screamed into cargo holds and fuel tanks, turning steel into fire. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Collins, flew so low his wingtip clipped the mast of a freighter. He kept going, spraying 50 cal rounds into the engine room until the ship split in half. Enemy gunners barely got a chance to fire back. "Ship 3's going down." "Destroyers hit, repeat, direct hit." "Bow's gone!" In less than 10 minutes, 4 Japanese ships were burning. 2 more had fled, smoke trailing like blood in the water. Back at base, the men who returned looked different. Tired, yes, but also lit up with something fierce behind their eyes. One of the gunners, soaked in sweat and oil, stepped off the plane and muttered, "We didn't hit them. We erased them." Pappy didn't smile. He just exhaled smoke and nodded. Later that night, as the rain finally stopped and the jungle hummed with crickets, he walked alone down the line of parked planes. Each one scarred, scratched, but still standing. He ran a hand along the nose of one, eyes lost in thought. Not about victory, not about glory. He was thinking about Clara, his kids, still in some camp behind enemy lines. He'd build 100 more monsters if he had to. Because every ship sunk, every convoy lost, was one step closer to bringing them home. The airfield was quiet the next morning, unusually so. No engine tests, no gunfire from the practice range, no yelling between mechanics. Just the low buzz of insects and the distant cough of someone waking up too early. The skies were grey, heavy with a storm that hadn't quite decided whether to break. It was the kind of silence that usually came after something big, or right before it. Pappy Gunn sat alone near the edge of the runway on an old ammo crate, staring out at the tree line. He held a small notebook in one hand, flipping through it slowly. Scribbled in pencil were sketches, numbers, notes, and ideas. Some crossed out, others circled 3 times. This was his war diary, but not the kind filled with emotions or reflections. No, this one was filled with ways to kill the enemy faster. One of the pages had the word napalm, underlined in thick strokes. He tapped the corner of the page, thinking. The latest mission had been a complete success, more than any of the brass had expected. And now, for the first time, he was being asked to come to a strategy meeting. That never happened before. Pappy was the guy who worked in the shadows, under hangars, not in polished rooms with maps and coffee. But orders were orders, even for him. He cleaned up, changed into a wrinkled uniform shirt with a torn collar, and headed to the command tent. Inside were a handful of colonels, a major from Naval Intelligence, and a young officer who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in weeks. Maps were spread across the table, red strings marking convoy routes and Japanese strongholds. The meeting dragged on. The brass used words like containment strategy, morale, and resource allocation. Pappy waited, arms crossed, until they finally got to the part that mattered. We believe the Japanese are preparing a fortified airstrip on an island near Mindanao, one of the colonels said. If they finish it, they'll control the southern route. It's got to be wiped out. Pappy leaned forward. Jungle or open? Mostly jungle. Thick canopy. You won't see anything from high altitude. He nodded slowly. Then we go low. Real low. The colonel hesitated. We're aware of your unique methods, gun, but this isn't a convoy. It's a jungle fortress. Good, Pappy replied. Let's light the whole thing on fire. He left the meeting with a new mission and a dangerous idea forming in his head. Back at the hangar, he gathered his crew. I want firebombs. Napalm if we've got it. If not, I'll make it. The mechanics looked at each other nervously. We've never mounted that on a B-25 before. We're going to now. Within 2 days, the fire-run planes were ready. Instead of rockets, they carried modified tanks full of thick, sticky incendiary gel. Dangerous stuff. If one round hit it, the whole plane could blow. But Pappy didn't care. He knew what was at stake. If the Japanese finished that airstrip, the Allies would bleed for every inch in the South Pacific. The target was deep inland, surrounded by trees and camouflaged bunkers. Normal bombers would fly too high to be accurate. Fighters didn't have the payload. Pappy's solution? Send in the monsters. At first light they launched. 10 of his modified B-25s, loaded with napalm, flying barely 50 feet off the ground, weaving through valleys and over trees like sharks through waves. As they reached the island, anti-air fire opened up. Bright orange flashes lit the jungle below. One of the planes took a hit to the wing and started trailing smoke, but it stayed in formation. These weren't ordinary pilots, they were guns men. They didn't back off. Drop on my mark, the lead pilot radioed. 3, 2, 1, now! The jungle lit up like it had been struck by lightning. Thick clouds of flame rolled over trees, huts, and gun emplacements. Screams echoed through the trees, muffled by the roar of engines and fire. The napalm stuck to everything, bunkers, tents, even running soldiers. It burned hotter and longer than regular bombs. It didn't just destroy, it erased. One plane didn't make it back. The others returned, wings scorched, bullet holes in the fuselage, but alive. Pappy stood on the tarmac as they landed, eyes on the sky, waiting for the last one. When it didn't show, he didn't speak for a long time. Later, he sat in the dark, sharpening a piece of metal on the workbench, sparks flying with each stroke. This war's not about who's braver, he muttered. It's about who's willing to do what the other side won't. He glanced at the photo of Clara again. I'll burn down the whole damn jungle if I have to. A week after the firebombing, the jungle was still burning. Recon photos showed nothing but blackened earth where the Japanese airstrip had once been. No more bunkers, no more anti-air nests, no more runway. Just ash, twisted metal and charred trees that stood like skeletons against the horizon. It was a brutal success, and it had sent a message. Pappy Gun's monsters weren't just machines. They were nightmares, and they didn't stop coming. But victory didn't taste as sweet as it should have. They lost 2 planes that day. One crashed in the jungle after taking a direct hit. The other was shot down over water during the return flight. No one saw parachutes, no radio calls, just silence. Pappy didn't talk about it. He never did. He just worked harder. He started modifying the tail sections now. He claimed the airflow was wrong when the planes came in low and fast. Too much drag, not enough lift. Most engineers would have run simulations, drawn diagrams. Pappy just took a hacksaw to the tail fins and reshaped them with welding rods and sheet metal, right there in the field. Won't that mess with stability? One of the new mechanics asked. Pappy grinned. Only if you don't know what the hell you're doing. The others laughed, but they were starting to see it. The man wasn't just a mechanic. He was something else. He could look at a plane like a doctor looked at a patient. He knew what it needed, even if it meant cutting into the bones. But his obsession was wearing on him. He barely slept anymore. The dark circles under his eyes were almost purple. He skipped meals, snapped at his crew, and went quiet for long stretches of time, just staring at engine parts like he was somewhere else entirely. One night, while everyone else drank or wrote letters home, Pappy sat alone with the radio. He'd rigged it to try and intercept Japanese transmissions. Not because he wanted intel, he was listening for a name. Any name, his wife's, his kids'. But every night, all he got was static and enemy codes he couldn't crack. Still, he kept trying. One evening, a weathered pilot named Maddox approached him. Maddox had flown 5 missions in Guns Monsters and still had a jagged piece of shrapnel in his thigh. "Sir, I've been meaning to ask, all this work, all this firepower, are you trying to win the war or end it?" Pappy didn't look up. "Same thing. No, I mean, is this about your family?" Pappy finally raised his eyes. They were red, glassy, but sharp. "They're out there somewhere. I don't care if I have to burn every island on this side of the damn ocean. I'll find them." Maddox nodded slowly. He didn't ask anything else. No one did after that. A few days later, the brass sent word of another high-risk mission. A Japanese command post had been set up deep in the highlands of Halmahera. Intelligence said it coordinated air and naval movement across the Banda Sea. Taking it out would cripple enemy logistics for weeks, maybe months. But there was a catch. The base was surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries, heavily fortified, and dug into the side of a mountain. Normal bombing wouldn't work. They needed something fast, aggressive, and surgical. They needed Pappy's monsters. Pappy walked into the planning tent, glanced at the map, and asked just one question. "How many guns can we carry if we strip out the co-pilot's seat?" The room went silent. "Sir," a major said cautiously, "you want to remove the co-pilot?" "Not all the planes," Pappy said. "Just the ones going in first. I need more firepower up front. If I've got to fly one myself, I will." No one doubted he meant it. Within hours, the ground crew began ripping out co-pilot chairs and installing extra ammo belts. They stacked 50-cal drums on the floor like sandbags and bolted down reinforced nose mounts. These weren't bombers anymore. They were flying battering rams. Before dawn, Pappy walked down the row of planes, inspecting them one by one. He placed his hand on each nose like a priest giving last rites. "You're gonna fly straight, you bastard," he muttered to one. "And you're gonna hit hard." As the engines fired up and the monsters prepared to rise again, the sky cracked open with distant thunder, like the heavens knew what was coming. And somewhere deep in Japanese territory, men drank coffee in bunkers, unaware that death had already taken off, flying low and fast. With 14 guns pointed right at them, the morning of the Halmahera strike was hotter than usual. The kind of heat that made metal hiss when touched and sweat cling to your skin before you even moved. The jungle stood still, waiting, like it could sense what was coming. Even the birds went quiet. Pappy stood at the edge of the runway, arms folded, watching his monsters roar to life one by one. The stripped-down B-25s, with their co-pilot seats removed and every inch packed with firepower, shook the earth as their engines growled. They didn't look like planes anymore. They looked like something born in a furnace, made to kill and not much else. The lead pilot on this run was Maddox, the man with shrapnel in his leg and fire in his eyes. He limped as he climbed into the cockpit but didn't complain. None of them did. Every man who flew Pappy's machines knew the risk. They also knew what those planes could do. Pappy stepped up to Maddox's window just before takeoff and handed him a hand-drawn map. It was covered in notes, sketches of bunkers, guesses about anti-air positions. Maddox looked down at it and asked, "You coming with us this time?" Pappy gave a half-smile. "Not today. Someone's got to be alive to build more of these damn things." Maddox nodded. "We'll make it count." As the planes lifted into the sky, their shadows slid across the jungle like dark omens. Pappy watched until they disappeared behind the clouds. Then he walked straight back to the hangar and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Halfway through the mission, the radios crackled. Visual on the mountain, spotting 2, maybe 3 batteries on the ridgeline, coming in low, then static. A second voice cut through. "Jesus, flak's heavy." Maddox took a hit. Port wings leaking, but he's still flying. More gunfire over the comms. Explosions, screams, then came the call that made Pappy's heart stop cold. "This is Maddox. Dropping now. All guns hot." Tell Gun he was right. The transmission cut. For the next 5 minutes, all Pappy could hear was garbled shouts and the distant sound of roaring engines. Then silence. He stood there frozen, eyes locked on the radio, waiting, hoping. Finally, a voice returned. "Target is hit." "Repeat, target is destroyed." Fireballs across the ridge. "Japanese comms are dead." "We got it." Pappy didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He just let out a long breath and sat down slowly. "Casualties?" The voice hesitated. 3 planes down. Maddox is among them. He went in with guns still firing. Pappy didn't reply. He couldn't. Later, when the surviving crews limped back to base, engines sputtering, fuselages riddled with holes, they were greeted by silence. No applause, no celebration. Just the sound of mechanics swarming them, checking damage, pulling wounded men from cockpits. Pappy waited until they were all offloaded, then walked over to Maddox's usual plane. It had landed without him, flown back by the gunner after the pilot died in his seat. Inside the cockpit was Maddox's flight log. On the last page, a note scrawled in grease pencil. "We burn bright, even if we don't burn long. Tell Pappy thanks." That night, the airfield went dark early. No drinking, no jokes, just quiet. Pappy sat alone on a barrel outside the hangar, turning a wrench over in his hand. Not fixing anything, just thinking. The war was taking pieces of him with every mission. Men he trusted, machines he'd built, hours of sleep he'd never get back. He looked out into the jungle and whispered, "How many more?" There was no answer. Just the hum of insects and the occasional echo of distant thunder, like the ghosts of the men he'd sent into the storm, were still out there, circling above the trees. The next morning, he walked into the hangar and ordered the crew to reinforce the bottom of the B-25s. "We're going lower," he said. "Next time I want them close enough to feel us before they see us." Someone asked what they were targeting next. Pappy just said, "Whatever the hell they think is safe," because the monsters weren't done yet, and neither was he. The next target came in the form of a manila folder stamped top secret and delivered by a courier who didn't stay long. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white, taken from a recon plane that had barely made it back. They showed a massive Japanese supply depot tucked along a hidden river on the southern edge of Mindoro. Warehouses, fuel tanks, ammunition stacks, and worst of all, dozens of crates marked with the Imperial Navy's rising sun. Heavy equipment, likely bound for the front lines. It was a hidden artery, pumping life into the Japanese war machine. Pappy stared at the photos, jaw tightening. There were 3 supply barges docked, already offloading cargo. Tall trees surrounded the site like a curtain, shielding it from high-flying bombers. The Japanese had grown smarter, but they hadn't grown smart enough. He rolled the photos into a tube, stuffed them under his arm, and walked straight into the hangar. "Wake the crew," he barked. "We're building ghosts." The men knew what that meant. It wasn't just another raid. This was something bigger. Pappy gathered the ground team and rolled out a chalkboard. On it he drew a rough outline of the supply base. Then he turned around, hands black with grease already. "We're going in below treetop level. I want the engines muffled, the colors dulled, and the fuselage as quiet as we can make it. We're going to fly right through their front door before they even hear us coming." One mechanic raised a brow. "You mean camouflage? On a B-25?" Pappy nodded. Yeah, we paint 'em green, darken the noses, and dull the reflectors. They're gonna look like shadows from the sky. But what about the firepower? We're not pulling any guns. This ain't a stealth mission, Pappy said, his voice low. It's an execution. By the next day, the hangar looked like an assembly line out of hell. Engines roared, paint fumes clouded the air. Welders sparked as they added blast shields to the underbellies. Ammo belts were coiled like vipers waiting to strike. Pappy even rigged a new drop mechanism, one that could release smaller fragmentation bombs in a tight cluster, aimed to tear through tin-roofed warehouses and fuel drums like a fist through paper. And just to make sure no one missed the point, he scrawled Ghost Riders across the nose of the lead plane in white chalk. A joke, maybe, but it stuck. The next morning, before the sun could burn away the fog, 6 of Pappy's camouflaged monsters lifted into the sky, sliding over the jungle canopy like hunting cats. Engines throttled down just enough to keep them quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough to fool tired lookouts. Inside the lead plane, the pilot leaned into the radio. "We're ghosts today, boys. Let's haunt some bastards." As they approached the target, the supply depot came into view, just like in the photos. Calm, busy, unaware. There were no alarms, no warning shots, no scrambling gunners. Not until the first plane dropped its frag load directly on the fuel dump. The explosion turned the jungle orange. Fire ripped through the trees, consuming crates and men alike. Screams echoed as napalm tanks hit next, blanketing the supply yard in sticky, burning death. Trucks detonated one after another like a chain reaction. Barges caught fire at the docks, their wooden hulls bursting like matchsticks. From the sky, it looked like the entire river had been set on fire. One Japanese soldier, spotted sprinting through the chaos, tried to fire a machine gun at the 4th bomber. He didn't make it 3 steps before a 50 cal burst stitched him into the dirt. It was over in 6 minutes. When the Ghost Riders turned back toward the jungle, the supply depot didn't exist anymore. Smoke followed them all the way back to base. When they landed, Pappy was already waiting, eyes sharp, lips tight. He didn't ask how it went. He could see how it went, the char on the wings, the empty belts, the black soot on the gun barrels. One of the gunners stepped off the ladder, helmet under his arm. They didn't even have time to scream. Pappy lit a cigarette and nodded once. That night, a recon pilot flew over the site. He radioed back 5 words that echoed through the base like gospel. "There's nothing left but ashes." Pappy didn't celebrate. Instead, he picked up his wrench and walked back into the hangar. Because there was always another depot, another base, another convoy. And until he had Clara and the kids back, he wasn't building bombers. He was building vengeance. The jungle was quiet again. Too quiet. After the Ghost Riders flattened the Mindoro depot, Japanese supply lines across the southern islands collapsed into chaos. Radio intercepts were full of panicked chatter. Entire convoys rerouted. Fuel shortages, ammunition delays. Some officers even abandoned their posts, afraid of the low growl of engines that came without warning. But for Pappy Gunn, it still wasn't enough. His hands were cracked from engine grease, his eyes red from nights spent hunched over blueprints under the hum of a single flickering bulb. The war had changed him. He no longer walked like an engineer, he stalked like a predator, always thinking, always listening, always building the next monster. Then one night, just past midnight, a coded message came through the intelligence tent. Pappy wasn't supposed to see it, but he saw everything. He barged in, barefoot, eyes blazing. "Give me that transmission." The officer hesitated. "Sir, it's classified." Pappy snatched it anyway. His hands trembled as he unfolded the page. A Japanese prisoner convoy had been sighted moving north through the Sulu Sea, likely en route to the mainland for relocation. Among the prisoners were civilians captured during the fall of the Philippines. The list wasn't complete. But there was one line that shattered Pappy's lungs like flak to the chest. Possible identification. Clara Gunn, 2 children. The paper dropped from his hand. His voice came low, flat and dangerous. "Get every mechanic, every gunner, every pilot who's flown with me, now." Within 20 minutes, the hangar was lit up like daylight, men scrambling, tools clanging, engines firing. The smell of fuel and steel filled the air. Pappy didn't need orders. He was the order. He pointed to the map pinned to the wall. "They're moving through here," he said, stabbing his finger at the route near Tawi Tawi. "Guarded by destroyers, at least 4 transport ships. We're going in. We hit fast, we hit hard, and we don't leave until those prisoners are off those boats." A young pilot asked, "Sir, we haven't even confirmed they're there." Pappy looked him dead in the eye. "She's there. I know it." By sunrise, 10 of his most heavily modified B-25s were ready. Painted black, armed with extra guns, carrying smoke canisters and homemade flares for signaling. This wasn't just an air raid, it was a message. As they flew out over the ocean, Pappy sat in the lead plane, this time in the co-pilot seat. He hadn't flown in months, but he wasn't letting this one pass him by. The sea below was calm, but his heart pounded like a drum. Then they saw it. 4 transports, 3 destroyers, and a dozen anti-air positions bristling on deck. The convoy was massive, but it didn't matter. Not to Pappy. "Go low," he shouted into the radio. "Light 'em up!" The sky exploded in gunfire. Bullets shredded through clouds. Tracers painted the air red and orange, but Pappy's monsters screamed through it like demons from the earth. Nose guns roared. Rocket pods hissed. Flares rained down in blinding bursts to mask their approach. Smoke grenades popped in front of the lead transport, giving cover for a drop run. "Target the decks," Pappy yelled. "Don't sink them, cripple them." One transport burst into flames at the bow, the engine room in ruins. Men jumped into the sea, screaming. Another lost its steering and spun sideways into a destroyer, metal crumpling like paper. The radio crackled with a voice from another B-25. "We see lifeboats, survivors jumping. Civilians on deck." Pappy's heart stopped. "Mark the location," he shouted. "I want air cover until we can get rescue boats in." Another pass was made, this time with the gun crews only targeting escort gunners and radar towers. Brutal, precise, and cold. They didn't bomb. They executed. Then it was done. The transports were disabled, not destroyed. The escorts were either sinking or fleeing, battered and humiliated. Pappy looked down at the lifeboats in the water, tiny shapes, some with children, others waving scraps of white cloth. His fists clenched on the window frame. He whispered, "Please, please be there." Back at base, Pappy didn't sleep. He waited on the tarmac for 16 hours, refusing food, refusing rest. Finally, a scout plane returned. The rescue boats had made it. Among the survivors, 1 woman, 2 children, all confirmed as American nationals. No names were said, no photos yet, but Pappy didn't need them. He walked away from the radio silent, into the hangar, into the shadows of his monsters. Because finally, after all the fire, all the blood, and all the fury, he had a reason to stop. Let me know if you'd like a closing epilogue or a historical note.